Sorry about that. It's just, it seems, why spend time with you watching me plug stuff in? I mean, you've probably seen enough hairy geeks trying to fix computers in front of you in your lives. Never want to see one again. I'm different, though, because, look, I can make eye contact. I haven't blushed yet, and I will try to speak in sentences. Mostly. Okay, this is called Digital Public Spaces. Partly because I'm involved in a project with the BBC around the idea of the digital public space, and you'll see why it all links together. But crucially, oh, that's exciting. Where did that one come from? Crucially, I want somewhere to put my reading notes where I can actually see them. We don't live in a digital age. We live in an age of electronics. Most of the things that we do are mediated by electronic devices, and many of those devices are now connected together. But to assume that it's a digital age implies somehow that the physical is disappearing or become less important. And clearly it's not going to do that. You're all assembled in this room precisely because physical presence remains important, because the ability to connect to other people remains important, because the physical objects and their manipulation is central to what you are as human beings. And that's not going to go away. Whatever some of the more hyperbolic high priests of digital might tell you, that is not changing. And this is a good thing. But that doesn't mean the world isn't changing. I look at myself, and for example, most of the media that I consume these days doesn't come from television or from radio or from print. It comes via the internet protocol. Most of the way I find out about the world is over devices that are connected to the internet, not to television broadcast systems, not to print, not to any of those other mechanisms. Yesterday, I found out about the awful helicopter crash in Vauxhall on Twitter about a minute after it happened. Somebody posted a photograph because they'd seen a cloud of smoke over the other side of the Thames from where they were living, followed very quickly by many more reports. I only bothered looking at a news report of it at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, because everything I needed to know about that horrible event had happened, was being relayed to me through Twitter, including video, including photographs. That photograph at the top was taken by my friend Sadie from her flat and posted up on Instagram for everyone to see. So we can't deny that the world is being shifted, that many of our assumptions about how we engage with information sources and with each other are being challenged by the capabilities, by the affordances of the network. And we are still at a relatively early stage in the development and deployment of that network and all the technologies that go along with it. So anyone who might think, oh, good, I understand the internet now, and I know how Twitter works, and I've got a Facebook page, and that's fine, I can relax. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but no, you can't. Because the fun is only just beginning. In the next year or two, for example, many, many more people are going to have very, very fast connections on their mobile phones. 4G has started in this country with EE, or however you're supposed to pronounce it. Yet one of the few major corporations whose entire existence and branding is predicated on drug culture from the 1990s, which I think is really admirable. And I certainly would like to take some E's if they were a bit cheaper. Just look at it. Just look at the branding. They're little tablets. Other people will be in that business quite soon. You'll be buying tablets, that sort of tablet, and mobile phones, and they will have the sort of connectivity you have at home, in fact, possibly faster than you have at home. So that's going to start changing the assumption about when you're connected and how you're connected. The always-on revolution will not just be always on and it sort of stutters, it will be always on at the fast speeds where you don't need to think about it first. And that will shift it. Sometime this year, developers are going to get their hands on these. These are Google's Project Glass. They are spectacles that have an HD camera here and a little overlay here that displays text information, a little microphone here that can respond to voice commands. They overlay your world with what's laughingly called augmented reality. So if I was wearing Google glasses and they were fully functional, firstly, I'd be streaming this event live onto the internet. You may or may not want that. But secondly, as I look around you, little flags would pop up next to each one of you telling me your name and where you worked from, whether you were a librarian or a publisher, what project you were involved with, who your siblings were, what your status was, whether you just broken up with someone on Facebook and therefore were worth hitting on later at the drinks party, all that valuable, whether my wife knew you and therefore it really wasn't worth sitting on you at the drinks party, all that valuable information would be available. And these are not in the lab. They are prototypes. They're out there. People will be using them. And we'll see more and more systems like this, replacing the camera phone-based augmented reality systems like Aurasma and Leia very, very quickly. That sort of thing will come common. This year, we're going to see driverless cars. You can license a driverless car in California already, and Google's cars have driven something like 180,000 miles without killing anyone, which is a lot better than many people. They are moving forward quite quickly. I really do think in 30 or 40 years' time, in developed Western countries, the idea that we were allowed sole control of half a ton of metal will seem as absurd as putting lead in paint or giving children laudanum. It'll just be madness. What sort of public safety thing was that? You were allowed to take that out and kill people with it? Because the technology just delivers. Closer to home, many of us will be having our own 3D printed objects. This is a company run by a friend of mine. They're called Makeys, and they are 3D printed dolls. You design the doll's face on a website, and they make it for you. They print it on a printer that prints solid objects. If you think the copyright issues around letting people copy chunks of T.S. Eliot in your libraries are bad now, what happens when they come in and they want to print parts for their Honda car, while they're still allowed to drive it, that are covered by design rights? What happens when they want to come in and print all the stuff because the templates are available to download freely over the internet from a website called, you'll love this, Thingiverse. That's universe, but thing. Worth chasing. And many places are already installing their own 3D printers. A friend of mine runs a cyber cafe in Stroud, Black Book Cafe, who's got a 3D printer in it. You will have 3D printers in all of your libraries and all of your offices as well. And you will use them to make useful things, and you'll use them to make specs of things, whatever. So that's going to happen. And of course, we'll all be carrying around not just smartphones, but bigger things. Have you heard this awful term, phablet? P-H-A-B-L-E-T? Okay, I'm never going to use it again. If you hear me use it, you're allowed to slap me, because it's such an awful construction. But we will be using screens that are bigger than our smartphones. The iPad, the original iPad, the 10-inch one, will become a coffee tablet. As in, you'll keep it at home. I have a small Nexus 7. I have a big iPad. The iPad never leaves the house. Use it occasionally for Twitter and stuff like that, but mostly to look at things like the Wasteland, like the Sonnets, like whatever, high-res, quality apps, where the screen quality really matters and the screen size really matters. So all of those things together, this is stuff that's easy to predict. This stuff is obvious. Looking 3, 4, 5 years out, maybe we'll start having direct neural inputs and things like that. Something's more complicated and science fiction-y, but this is just obvious stuff. The challenge, therefore, to anybody who is trying to engage with an audience of any type is immense, as newspaper publishers have been finding out for the past few years. That once you have alternative sources of information, then the thing you thought you knew how to do in order to attract an audience or engender interest or make money stops working. And it can sometimes be very, very hard to cope as that happens. And it's not surprising that it's hard. This is not supposed to be easy. This really is a challenge. This isn't just one of those things where, oh no, some people weren't as good as they thought they were and they're not doing very well. Yeah, you've got HMV going out of business this week. Okay, how many people here were surprised at the news that Blockbuster had gone out of business because they thought it already had? Exactly. So, you've got massive shifts going on. And in my more sort of philosophical moments, I'd say that the change that's happening now is more comparable to the invention of reading than it is just to the invention of the printing press. That what we're doing now in moving to a largely screen-based world where most of the data we deal with most of the time is or has been in a digital format at some point, is a shift as big in terms of how we conceive of and engage with the physical world as the move to literacy, as the invention of the alphabet was 5,000, 6,000 years ago. That it is on that scale. And if that's the case, it's not surprising we don't really know how to cope, and we seem sometimes to be making up as we go along. Because we are making it up as we go along. We're inventing some of this stuff from scratch for the very first time. And we look to trends and buzzwords like convergence and disintermediation, but they don't actually explain what is happening. And they're usually inadequate to cope with the sheer complexity of it all. We're not actually seeing media forms converge. Everything is not becoming a mush of websites. We're actually seeing significant differentiation between the types of communication. There are nuances between writing something on a blog, putting something on Facebook, tweeting about it, sending someone an email, sending someone a text, writing someone a physical. All of those different forms of communication still continue to coexist. And they still have value for us as human beings, as ways of finding out about the world, ways of sharing with other people. However, very few of the business models that underpinned them are any longer sustainable. And that's a bit of a problem for those ones that require spending money or capital or resource. And very few people really understand where it is going to go. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about what my view is as somebody who's slightly on the other side of things, if only because I am that sad geek. Because I have been using the internet since 1984, and it only started in 1983. Because I actually, and confession time here, I have a degree in computer science, and I used to be a programmer. Okay, like being a functional alcoholic, I haven't written a line of code for a good 6 months, but it could always happen again. I know there's always a WordPress site or two to hack. So if we can't tell in advance which innovations are going to succeed, and if we can't really tell what it means for all the established forms of engagement, if we don't know what publishers and librarians are actually going to do, what point is there in asking those questions? There may be no point asking the small, detailed question just because the lessons aren't generalizable. And it may actually be time now to step back slightly. Instead of saying just, how do we get people into libraries, ask some of the bigger questions. For example, the question, what use is reading? I'd say that was a pretty big, substantial, chunky question that we could ask ourselves now. And if we can come up with a good answer to it, it may well start to shape the way we approach all of the technologies that are being rolled out and made available in the world by people who aren't asking that question, who will do those things whether or not it has an impact on us. When Mark Zuckerberg sat down with the Facebook team and they decided to launch their social graph search yesterday, I doubt they thought a moment about library users. I really doubt there was a paragraph in the plan saying, impact on libraries, this is something we've really got to think about here, Mark. Given that they're not thinking about you, you have to be able to respond at a higher level to the things they're doing, and that means asking those bigger questions. And if we're very lucky, the answers that emerge will be ones that help shape the way publishers, librarians, and readers, and those who care about reading, deal with the unpredictable and unknown stuff that is inevitably coming our way. And it may well be that the exact form of the digital media landscape that's emerging is less important than the fact that somewhere out there are the lakes of literacy and that they're near to the library steps. And that is a very bad pun, and I apologize for that, but you can just live with it. And the library steps are going to be important. They will, I believe, remain important. And let me tell you one reason why. So this is Nick Carr, and Nick Carr's a friend of mine, although I've never met him. We know each other because we post on each other's blogs and we exchange tweets and emails, and we're both engaged in an ongoing dialogue about the impact of the internet on our lives and the ways we think. And so, though I don't know Nick Carr, I know him very well. And though I've never met him in the real world, I feel that he is a friend of mine, and I would happily call him a friend even though we've never actually shared the same physical space. And that fact alone is interesting to me. That I feel that I know enough of him and have had enough encounters with him in a variety of ways, many of them asynchronous. So I post something on a blog, he posts something back, we share each other's ideas, many of them like that, to feel an affinity for him. So a couple of years ago, Nick wrote a book called The Shallows. And in The Shallows, he expounded a thesis, which is that this wonderful world of internet-based, screen-based, interactive multimedia is inhibiting our capacity both to think deep thoughts and, more crucially, to engage deeply and fully with a text, with an extended text. That deep reading and immersion in the linear text were directly challenged by the ways we were using new media. And because he thinks that deep reading and careful thought are the pillars of the Enlightenment, In his view, this was a bad thing. And he wondered over a couple of pages or so what you could do about it. And if you don't like Twitter, and if you have fantasies about the impact of Facebook, then it's the sort of book you should read, because it will really, it's like sort of Stephen King equivalent for someone who cares about reading. It is that chilling and frightening. And given that we look around our world today and we see today's middle class especially, but increasingly every child in the West, growing up into a world that is dominated by network devices, where munching, poking, and pinging, I trust you all know what those are and what device you do those with. Yes, these are things you do with a BlackBerry. Munching is to take a screenshot using screen capture, and poking is sending something to a friend, and ping is sending it. Poking is telling a friend you're there, and pinging is sending them a message. I only know this because of some research by my friend Stephen Carrick-Davis with young people, because I don't do that anymore. I don't use a BlackBerry. I have higher aspirations to iPhone 5s and things. Sorry, bad joke. Today's kids are growing up in a world where these devices are commonplace, and their engagement with text is largely under 160 characters. Question is, what can we do about it, and what should we do about it? Now, I was lucky enough to grow up in a world where that was my means of communication home when I was at university. And when my mum was lucky to get a letter every couple of weeks. And as a result, I was taught to read. And I did philosophy at university, so I was taught to read incomprehensible texts in libraries without fear, to the point where at last some meaning began to emerge, where you could be given an essay question about, are there synthetic a priori truths, and think, oh yeah, I can probably deal with that, instead of thinking, who is this idiot and why is he asking me this question when confronted with the supervisor? So I look at myself and think, okay, I have this skill base, and as a result of those 20 years without computers, the impact of the internet on my life and my activity is going to be very different from that of my daughter, who's 21, and who built her first website when she was 4. Who has never known a world, because I'm her father, didn't have mobile phones and screens and laptops and internet and everything in it. And therefore, all of her cognitive structures have been shaped around the idea that the network is not just available, but there to be used, and that communication happens with it and through it. That doesn't mean there weren't books in the house as well, but it does mean everything else was there right from the start. Now, some people might think that exposing her to all of that from an early age was doing her a disservice. In fact, Susan Greenfield does think that and has told me it more than one time in public. But she's wrong. Well, other opinions are available, as Mark Kermode likes to say, but they're wrong. But in fact, I was doing something much more interventionist to her at the same time, something much more radical. I was teaching her to read. We weren't born to read. Reading's not innate. We're not genetically predisposed to read either. A child in isolation will not develop literacy, but they will develop language. We have evolved so that language is as hardwired into our brains as anything can be, but reading definitely isn't. We invented reading as a species just a few thousand years ago, seconds ago, in terms of evolution, and with this invention, we have chosen to rearrange our brains. Everyone in this room has had their brain rearranged by being taught to read. It was important, obviously. We value it, but we shouldn't assume it's something that just happens. And in her fantastic book, Proust and the Squid, the neuropsychologist Marianne Wolf goes in detail into the ways in which a literate person's brain differs from that of an illiterate person. She looks at the evidence about how our neuroanatomy shifts when we teach somebody to read, and the conclusion she reaches, and I think it's a compelling one, is essentially that teaching someone to read is a way of doing brain surgery on them without a scalpel. That as we teach someone to read, we are rewiring their brains. Now, we do it for very good reasons. We believe that it's the only way in which they're going to be useful in society in adulthood. But we've decided to do it. We've decided to impose this way of thinking on people, on every child. We see it as a target for 100% literacy. We see it as a failure if there are illiterate children in our society anywhere. Now, firstly, maybe you should all be grateful that we as a wider society have decided to spend billions of pounds each year building a captive market for the publishers and giving you audiences for your libraries. You know, we could have decided not to, but no, we choose to spend all this money on the education system just to give you young minds to influence. You should be very grateful for that. Okay? Whatever else is being spent on libraries. Okay, I'm joking here. But we have certainly decided as a society that we want every child to read. What we've then done, however, is we placed a special responsibility on you all as librarians, because we've asked you to ensure that children develop not just an ability to read, but a love of reading. We don't ask the maths teachers to make the kids love maths. We ask them to teach them maths so they can do the stuff they have to use maths for. You, however, are different. You have to make children love reading and carry it forward into adulthood. You're there to ensure that they want to engage with the text more than just for functional reasons, that something else comes out of it. And that is an astonishingly important responsibility. And of course, in this time of radical change, of shift, when the new technologies are emerging and we don't know what they're doing, that burden is exacerbated because of the successes of librarians in previous generations. Those of you in this room who have been librarians for many years have done so well at your job in the pre-digital time that now, as this tsunami of change sweeps over not just the library service, but publishing and the whole writing industry, you have to maintain those high standards. And this is not easy. And it's why projects like the Digital Skills Sharing Project become so important, because they offer pointers to ways in which the great things that librarians have done in the past with the products of the publishers can be sustained and can grow and can not just survive, but thrive and move forward. Now, the ability to read fluently only actually was possible because our brains are very, very flexible. The plasticity of the human cortex, the ability to make new connections, allows us to teach a child to read. Okay? The links are made between the visual cortex and memory areas to allow us to look at words on a page, to very quickly and fluently extract meaning from them by transferring the graphemes, the written bit, into phonemes, into sounds, by passing those sounds to the language processing area, by linking those together to begin to extract meaning, even while we're in the middle of reading a sentence. It is an astonishing thing that we do in our heads. Quite amazing. But that power in the brain is something that can be used by other activities. And the question to ask is, in a screen-based world, which bits of our brain does the internet want, and can reading afford to spare them? Does engaging, okay, that's my desk last week, okay? I was a bit excessive, but I was busy. So does being able to engage fluently and fluidly with 3 screens and 2 other devices, doing about 6 different things, many of which are text-based, but many of which are also visual, require the use of the parts of my brain that I should be using for deep engagement with a long text? Well, possibly. We don't know the answer to that. What we can say with some certainty is that it is just as likely that learning how to do that has an impact on my brain anatomy as it does that learning how to read does. So there is absolutely a question to be asked. And what comes out of that question is to say that if we value fluent reading, if we value engagement with the text, whether it's presented on a screen or in print is in fact irrelevant to this question. If we value that engagement, then what can be done to ensure that in this world we still teach kids how to read fluently and deeply? What are the issues that arise that are special because this is there as an alternative? And what areas are different to those that were raised by television? Because libraries survive television, libraries survive radio, libraries survive newspapers. Will they remain relevant with this available? Or rather, more crucially, is reading still so important? Is it the basis of the Enlightenment to make it worth preserving against the onslaught of that or the onslaught of that? Now, I think it is, because I think that my ability to be fluent in 140 characters depends crucially on my ability to be fluent in 140 pages. that this is not a different form of literacy, that expressing myself long and short rely on the same skills, the same ability to marshal facts, the same ability to use language to its maximum power in the space available to me. And I think my ability to have things to say on Twitter comes from the fact that I can read a 300-page book, that I can follow someone on the intellectual journey that they describe in that book and come out knowing more about the world, that I can read a novel and empathize with the characters. All those things about core literacy are actually the things that make this valuable, useful, and interesting, and not just, I had eggs for breakfast, which I do occasionally tweet, and you can find pictures of my eggs on Instagram, should you be interested, and sometimes they are very good eggs indeed. So it may be that what we're looking at is different forms of literacy. It may be that what we're actually looking at is expressing what we would call core literacy in different ways. Whether it's either of those still means that at the heart of it will be something resembling a book, a text, something resembling that longer form that we want kids to learn how to engage with, we want them to love, we want them to work with. And we want to do that so that books count in people's lives. That's my son ignoring my library, by the way. I thought that was a very poignant photograph. We want to do that because the way we read shapes our engagement with online as well. This is my friend Mo. You can't see it, but he's got blue hair. I thought I'd cut off the hair, too shocking. You can cope with dissected brains, but Mo's hair is very, very bright. Mo is incredibly digitally literate. He's a very talented programmer. And I took that photo because he is immersed in the screen in it. The real world has vanished from his mind as he's reading that, just as the real world vanishes from your mind when you're reading a very good novel. However, when you're reading the novel, it's you and the text. Through that screen are billions of other people. The space he has access to through the screen of his computer is very different from the space you have access to through the pages of a book. And the issue about how we manage those different engagements is a unique one, because we haven't been able to do that with the same facility. We are members of communities. We have an idea about the broader society we live in, but it's never been presented to us on a shiny screen, on a laptop, allowing us to interact so directly before. Just because society exists in the abstract is one thing. The online society doesn't exist in the abstract. It is very concrete. It is as concrete as all of us in this room. And so while the library's always offered access to the private space in the mind, for me, the challenge that's facing you all now is how the library can be a gateway to the public space online that is made available through these technologies. And how we can link together what's going on in my head, what's going on in the library, what's going on online, in ways that serve the interests of all. How we can construct this liminal space, this new space that comes out of the connection that is so easily available using these technologies, and how we can give it value and give it meaning. We've made this space. Many of us already live significant parts of our lives in it. I know I do. And you have the opportunity to be a gateway to it. Either for those who, for whatever reason, can't afford to own their smartphones and own their laptops and connect to the internet at home, which is obviously really crucial. But I think just as significantly, for those who appreciate that the sense of community that comes from being in a shared physical space while accessing a shared online space brings value to both. Now, each individual library has the unique property of being the only place that is the place it is, to paraphrase Walter Benjamin talking about a work of art. Every room in your library is the room in your library, and not anywhere else, and nowhere else is that room or that space. And that is a very important characteristic. Even if the library is a gateway to an infinitely replicable online virtual space, we have to acknowledge that the combination of a mind in a room online is itself unique. It never happened before, it will never happen again. And so this is not about saying everything needs to be the same. It's saying we have to understand which differences emerge and which are significant, as libraries offer not just access to the space in our heads, but the spaces online. And that's something which we are still, I think, a long way from understanding. Now, this is not a problem that's unique to libraries. It also applies to offices. It's the reason why so many businesses are so awful at engaging with the capabilities of online for their staff. That's why local authorities block Facebook and companies block Twitter and don't really seem to understand that their business is now transacted in a world in which the expectation of being online is not just reasonable, but sort of absolutely necessary. And so it is with you. You need to think about what it is that a library does online that is important. So the success of the Digital Stills project for me is in finding ways to point to how libraries can navigate this new purpose, this new occupation of the online space. To be not gateways or portals to it in that simple-minded, here's a home page, click on this to go somewhere, but rather to assimilate the capabilities of online engagement into the things that are offered in the physical space, and always remembering that in the end, it's about the reader and the text. It's about helping people find ways into the text, helping them find ways to engage for themselves. You will never know what happens inside the head of a reader, but you can certainly make it easier for them to get the thing they're looking for. And looking at the projects and the initiatives and the ideas that have been done so far, what's really heartening is just how much progress is being made towards thinking in those terms. And ideally, we'll see the next generation of young readers seamlessly moving between the different forms of engagement that are possible. And losing themselves in the library won't just mean losing yourself in a book, but losing yourself in yourself. Thank you.